Chapter 18, No More Mr. Nice Guy. A lot has happened in the 3.5 years since the world hailed the new European leaders' historic Mideast peace plan, touted at the time as Earth's last best hope for an enduring peace, or some such rubbish. By now, the frightened and hungry and 1.5 billion less numerous inhabitants of the earth know just how wrong they were to buy into it all. Whatever it was not the road to peace. The question remarkably remains, whose fault was this war? If the truth were told, and it won't be, by the way, everyone would realize that the Antichrist's peace plan was fatally flawed from its conception. Comprehending neither the nature nor the motivation of Islam, the Antichrist had hamstrung Israel and dangled its helpless form like a tasty morsel before the covetous eyes of the ravenous Muslim wolf. No one who understood the real Muslim agenda would have been surprised when Gog snapped at the bait. But therein lay the problem. No one understood. Everyone assumed that Islam was a religion, not a political doctrine with political objectives. So everyone outside of Dar al-Islam was caught unawares. Then came the reaction. Nuclear holocaust. Amazingly, the European leader's story is holding so far. He's placing the blame squarely where it's expected, on the Jews. But slippery to the end, he defends them before the world. Yes, the Israelis nuked the invading Muslims, but it was totally justified, a case of self-defense. Outnumbered 1,000 to 1, their very national existence was in danger. Although I'm horrified at the outcome, I'm sure that you can all see that they were given no choice in the matter. The Jews, of course, have no idea that he's lying. Like the rest of the world, they actually believe their own military was responsible for pushing the button. Many of them are even proud of it. But the truth has been buried, literally. Every Israeli technician who was involved in preparing the warheads for the Antichrist, with a gun to his back, has disappeared. Casualties of the war, it is claimed. Ironically, the Antichrist owes his life to the fact that he was in Israel, not in Europe, when the bombs started falling. His own capital city, along with 100 other major European population centers, was decimated by the blasts. Every major EU and NATO military installation was hit. Russia subsequently received a similar pounding at the hands of the Americans, but the land is so vast, only the largest cities and bases were targeted. More to the point, little or no damage was done to Russia's nuclear strike capability because of the mobility of their launch platforms, Typhoon-class submarines and mobile truck-based missile launchers. Russia's first order of business, even before its first launch against Europe, had been to move as much of their nuclear arsenal as they could to new and undisclosed locations. About half of their nuclear stockpiles had been successfully secreted out of harm's way. Almost all of the readily prepped Russian nukes had been used against Europe. Russia, of course, had hoped that their intelligence concerning the West would prove correct, that America had grown so soft, liberal, and politically correct, they would never rise to the challenge and launch a counterstrike. Their brightest minds had predicted that America would not come to Europe's aid, but would instead play possum until the danger blew over, going no farther than lodging diplomatic protests at the UN. And indeed, that had been the first instinct of the American leadership, to hunker down and let Europe reap the whirlwind. The prevailing mood was that Americans were sick and tired of having to risk their necks to bail Europe out of their self-inflicted problems. What had they ever offered in return? Even when all those Americans had disappeared without a trace a few years back, far more than in any other country, the Europeans hadn't lifted a finger eager to help their crippled ally. The French, for that matter, hadn't done anything tangible to affirm their friendship since 1781. But when the Vatican was taken out with a direct hit, Catholics throughout the entire Western Hemisphere demanded revenge, though their diplomats called it a nuclear response. And the U.S., whose own Catholics were howling in rage, was clearly the only nation on earth prepared to deliver it. But against whom? The Russians had been as surprised as anyone else when the Vatican went up in smoke. They had purposely avoided Rome. Whether it was out of superstition or prudence wasn't clear. There was no military installation within the city proper, though several bases within Italy had been targeted. But they weren't denying it either. They didn't want to appear weak or uncommitted. And besides, they weren't absolutely sure it hadn't actually been a mistake or a deliberate disobedience of order on the part of one of their commanders. The truth didn't occur to anyone. The Antichrist had instructed one of his own agents to drive to Rome with a hydrogen bomb on the back of a pest control van. His idea of a joke. Parked on a side street near St. Peter's, while the agent made his getaway, the truck didn't look out of place until the Vatican City evaporated in an inferno the likes of which Dante could never have imagined. And since no one was familiar with Revelation 17:16,
the 10 horns will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire.
No one was shocked when the European governments comprising the Antichrist's European Federation invoked emergency powers to tap the Vatican's vast hidden wealth in order to provide relief to the people of the Roman Catholic world. Humanitarian relief, of course, was the last thing on their minds. It made no difference, of course, that the Russians weren't actually responsible for the demise of Rome. Amid so much Russian-caused devastation in Europe, they certainly looked guilty. So America, under pressure from its Western allies, launched its own strike, hoping against hope that the Russians had used up all of their nuclear capability attacking their primary target. They had not, but their response was so slow in coming due to delays as the Russians scrambled to prepare their remaining nukes that the nation grew tired of holding its collective breath. Many who had fled the big cities were on their way home when the first blast occurred in Washington, D.C., severely curtailing America's ability to plan its future military moves. One by one, sometimes weeks apart, America's prime military targets and premier cities were hit, or missed, as the case may be. Russia's intercontinental missile technology, having been designed in an era when political gamesmanship was the holy grail, looked great in parades, but proved somewhat less than reliable in practice. Several, no one would ever know how many, went nuclear on their launch pads, incinerating huge tracts of Siberian forest. Several more fell short, 1,000 miles short, of their intended targets in the U.S., setting Canada's vast woodlands ablaze. The fact that Russian targeting technology wasn't nearly as accurate as the Americans only added to the terror. A missile intended for Norfolk Naval Base landed instead on Colonial Williamsburg, which hadn't been a particularly good military target for well over 300 years. Another, aimed at Florida's Homestead Air Force Base, landed 100 miles north, near Orlando, killing Mickey Mouse instantly. Just when it seemed it couldn't get any worse, a 320-meter-long asteroid named Apophis that NASA scientists had been tracking since December of 2004 plummeted into the North Atlantic, sending Buick-sized chunks of white-hot debris raining down on Earth from Budapest to Detroit. The tsunami Apophis generated swept over the British Isles and inundated Western Europe and cut a swath through America from New England to the mid-Atlantic. Boston and New York, gone. London and Amsterdam, gone. Philadelphia and Paris, badly damaged. And it wasn't over. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge was ground zero, and the seismic destruction the asteroid unleashed made the initial impact look tame by comparison. Tectonic plates that normally separated an inch or so per year were suddenly ripped apart, exposing the sea floor to the Earth's molten mantle through a crack tens of meters wide for the entire length of the Atlantic Ocean. The tsunamis alone killed 50% of the population living within 50 miles of the Atlantic shoreline, and not just in the north. Miami, Havana, Caracas, Rio de Janeiro, and Buenos Aires, all having escaped the nuclear carnage, were each wiped out by an unstoppable wall of water, the result of 100 nearly simultaneous Richter scale 9+ earthquakes in the mid-Atlantic. Africa fared better, but only because it has fewer densely populated cities along its western shoreline. After a few days, the first of hundreds of new volcanic islands began appearing in mid-ocean, belching ash and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Like a string of Mount Pinatubo's, their smoke darkened the sky all over the world, adding to the billions of tons of radioactive dust the recent nuclear war had pumped into the air. The sun's light was measurably obstructed, and the moon, when it could be seen at all, took on a ghastly red hue. The only reason anybody knew about this new island chain, however, was the imagery being sent down from orbiting satellites. Not a single ship in the entire Atlantic Ocean, north or south, remained afloat. Worse, when the scientific research vessels were finally able to reach the area, they could find no signs of life in the ocean. None at all. Everything from whales to plankton had died. The fact that all of this, either overtly or between the lines, had been predicted in the Bible didn't raise as many eyebrows as it should have. Relatively few people knew about the prophecies of the last days, since the Christians had been raptured years before and the Bible had been suppressed ever since then. But between the 144,000 Jewish messengers and the angelic warnings that had been proclaimed all over the world for the last several years, the remaining population wasn't completely in the dark. In the dim light of the unseasonable winter that seemed to be descending upon the earth, small pockets of survivors heatedly discussed two things. Where are we going to find something to eat? And is all of this the result of man's folly or God's judgment? The second question tended to divide the room into warring camps. All of the weight of public opinion in recent years, from the media, organized religion, and even the politicians, had agreed, even insisted, that God was whatever you conceived him to be, a sort of great spirit who resided in all living things. Most people weren't totally stupid, of course. They'd figured out what this really meant, that God was neither personally interested in their welfare or behavior, nor could he do anything to help or harm them. In other words, even if he existed, and the pseudo-intellectual rhetoric screamed that he did not, they were perfectly free to live their lives without his interference, and certainly without his standards of conduct. This in turn meant that the only real rule in life was, don't get caught. But the horrific events of recent months, if you had been lucky enough to live through them, looked for all the world like the wrath of God, whatever that meant. It had never been this bad before. A quarter of the Earth's population was dead. The whole planet was an ecological disaster area. And then there was the nagging memory of the event that had started everything rolling downhill, when all the born-again, Bible-thumping wackos had disappeared en masse. Try as they might, no one had ever satisfactorily explained that one. Could it be that there was a God, and that he was trying to tell them something? Don't be so blankety-blank gullible," was the inevitable response. "You haven't actually seen God do anything, have you? No. Everything that's happened is the direct result of our leaders making bad decisions, one after the other. And you can trace it all back to one thing. If the Jews hadn't nuked the Arabs, none of this would have happened." Then as now, no philosophy that couldn't be reduced to a soundbite was given much credence. It didn't have to make much sense or fit the facts. It only had to be plausible, succinct, and politically correct. Everything was somebody else's fault.